with Lucasfilms, and this is my version of the story. Phone rings, I pick up the phone. The phone isn't in your pocket, it's attached to a wall, because this is a really long time ago. So the phone rings, and my agent is on the end of the line, and she said, so 2 people from Del Rey said they're super late delivering a book for Star Wars, and they went out to lunch together, and they said, it's got to be about Yoda. Who could write a book about Yoda? And as the story was told to me, at the same moment, they looked up at one another and said, Sean. Leading me to think, how do you get to be the answer to that Jeopardy question? Like, I look back over the novels that I had published that time and think, what about this made them think totally the Yoda guy? But I'm old version Golden Age Star Wars. I was 11 when Star Wars came out. So I made you guys have better tech than we did. I had to take a piece of PVC tubing and wrap it with electrical tape to a flashlight to make my lightsaber. So I was very excited to have a chance to do something in the world, and then particularly I loved the character of Yoda from Empire, and part of my particular feeling is I didn't want to lose the sort of grumpy weirdness of Yoda, who sometimes, would begin to drift into wise old man space, which was less interesting to me than grumpy, weird, wise old man. So I was very excited to take, the fact that I said yes means that I probably was the person to write it.
I was going to say, I think I can speak for most of the people in this room that I think you nailed Yoda. Oh yeah, they were right. Follow Apprentice, Count Dooku, how did that?
So yes, the remit that they gave me was, it's a book about Yoda. It needs to somehow foreground Dooku, and it's happening at this point in the timeline. And inside those lines, I got a lot of freedom to build those characters. So whatever mistakes there are entirely mine. I had free reign pretty much to do Yoda and Dooku the way I saw them. I noticed that I was reading, because I'm on a panel later with Matt Stover talking about Shatterpoint as well, and so I was reading that the pitch for Shatterpoint was Heart of Darkness with Jedi. For what it's worth, the original pitch for this book was the Sith who came in from the cold. So I pitched a kind of Le Carre-esque cat and mouse game about would he or would he not come back as a sort of emotional engine, and then inside that it's a striking fact. So I should back up. So I have a couple of kids. One of them, the oldest one, was the first editor on this book when she was 14. She was there. So you owe some of the good things in that book to her.
Only the good things.
So I was really struck reading the lore as getting my head around who are the Jedi in more detail than I had known just from watching the books. That, to put it in the harshest way that Dooku puts it, every Jedi as a child, their parents decided they could live without. And so that became kind of a linchpin about the relationship between Dooku and Yoda, and parents and children, and when we feel abandoned and when we feel betrayed.
Qui-Gon says, well, he thinks he's lying. And that's like, I'm surprised you were able to get away with something like that, quite frankly, because that adds a huge layer of tragedy and heart to Dooku. When at the time he'd only really appeared in the third act of Attack of the Clones. I don't know, like it seems like they just gave you an open canvas.
Yeah, they were very generous with that stuff and gave me a lot of free rein to do it. But I think the book doesn't work if we don't believe there's a part of Dooku that damnation isn't interesting if there isn't the possibility of salvation, right? If we don't believe that there's some chance, even if Dooku doesn't admit it to himself that he really, really wants this, that he can see that there's only one way this is going to end with Sidious. Because he has, if you guys remember at all, there's an early scene between him and Asajj Ventress where Ventress says, "Make me your apprentice," and he says, "I don't want to because it's going to go very badly." That hopefully is clear when you read it, that he's talking about his own relationship to Darth Sidious. So the sense that that father figure is not going to work out, I think, is pretty deeply there for him.
And later on, to keep the interest thing, she also challenges him when she's in the tough spot. She says, "Kill your minister." You know, I know how this works. And that's another moment of surprising clarity, because at that point you had read the script, yes, for Revenge of the Sith, so you knew where things were ending up for Dooku and this character, and it was. I understand why the novel has become such a cult classic, because as a Clone Wars story, if you're to read one story in between these two, especially for some of these characters, it really is a definitive moral arc between clones and Sith, and I can't commend you enough for that.
Oh,
But
thank you.
obviously, those aren't the only characters in the book. Scout and we, and so taking that, every Jedi, the abandonment concept, how did you take that into these new characters, introducing new characters to the audience?
So, going back to being 11, I decided I would be a writer when I was 7 years old. And I didn't realize that any work would be involved for about a decade. So I didn't do any actual writing for a long time. But I was quite confident that I was going to do it. And the summer that Star Wars came out, 1977, line popped into my head that went, "The Force is weak in this one." And I really wanted to write the story of that person. So literally that waited around for 30 years until, I hope it's not more than that. Oldness, it's creeping up. So I've been waiting a long time to do that, and then I said, I think it would be useful to have a couple of Padawans go on this journey, because all Yoda all the time soliloquizing your interior is not going to be as much fun as Yoda having someone to bounce off. You can't, a teacher without someone to teach, you don't have enough to do. So they said, okay, well, let's take at least one character from the film, which is who is known in canon to have died at the temple. And then I wanted a second one, because it's always good when two characters can argue and bicker and sort of balance against one another. And so I ended up with the idea that they would sort of be at opposite places. You know, one who's very, very gifted and one who's just working every angle to get by. And then sort of lace them together. I guess I'll mention the thing I said to you out in the hall, which is one of the things that I did not expect about this book, is I went in to write it and I knew about the massacre in the temple, and I started to write quite quickly, and then it got harder and harder, and I finally called Lucasfilm and said, I cannot apparently write this book knowing that everyone I'm writing it about is going to die. So I am begging for the life of one of my Padawans. Please canonically spare her. I understand that he has to die, but I just can't I can't stand in a position of sort of ironically knowing they're gonna have all these things, but it's not gonna matter. So please promise me that one of them can get to survive. And probably the most surprising thing about my Star Wars experience was they said, okay, and said, we will spare the life of your imaginary character. Which, for some reason, was extremely important to me, possibly because I had a 14-year-old daughter at the time, and I just couldn't quite.
Thanks for not killing me.
So,
There you go.
did you have a,
Yeah. Well, was thinking about a totally different thing, which is how do you come up with a Yoda actor? Where did that idea come from? Someone portraying, were you thinking about that for the panel as well?
so, here's the thing. I started the story telling you that Del Rey was very late on this book.
Yeah.
So I had about 4.5 months to write. And I take usually a little more than a year to write a book. So it had to be written very, very fast. I'll say a little side thing about that in a moment. One of the consequences of that is there's a certain damn the torpedoes quality. So sometimes my hands would just start making a scene, and we're gonna do that. So we have to get Yoda off planet hidden, and so there has to be some sort of double, and then my fingers were just writing the scene. I don't know if there's anyone in the room who's ever read any of Walter John Williams' sort of heist space opera books like House of Shards, but there is a definite House of Shards vibe to that passage. So, yeah.
Then to keep bringing it back
At this moment. So, yes, the variance on, or when you see certain idioms, there's bound to have been Leland, please help me fill in the right words at this point. The way of speaking and the kinds of things Yoda says were me, but the Star Warsing of it. Because even then, the canon was very deep.
Well, we've already made good time here, 15 minutes in, and I just want to touch on as many of the good ideas that I think are in there. Solaris
Fidelis.
Fidelis, yes.
Solus and Fidelis.
Solus and Fidelis, excuse me. Solaris is the game. These ancient assassin, but also waiter droids. I mean, their first scene where they're playing, essentially chess in the rain on the top of a, aging skyscraper. Like, where does that idea come from?
Yeah. Did I mention it was really fast?
It's cool though. I think it's great. I think these characters are great.
I liked them too for obvious reasons, and they're doing a job, right, narratively, because their names, right, Solus and Fidelis, are. It's wherever you look in this book, there are going to be things about loyalty and betrayal, right, at every point, and it's a moment in the time when one of the things that happens is the Jedi go out and people think of them as like the Chancellor's secret police. Like, that's super creepy, that's not what we meant to be. But if there's a little scene where one of the Jedi says, I do not wish to follow I feel we've become a militarized police force, and that is not the way. So there are a lot of questions about what is right action? What is the moral thing to do? And the gentleman's personal gentle things are there to have another sort of sideways glance at those questions of loyalty and independence. Also, Star Wars likes to have droids, obviously, and it feels like you always want to have some representative from that thing. And the other thing that's interesting about Star Wars is that it's the world is so deep in time. Like there's something nice about even the machines might be 300 years old, and everything has this sort of aged quality about it. So it's a nice moment, I think, when you first meet them, and one is still, besides the names, one is in freshly painted livery, and the other is basically dinged and chipped, and it's got none of that flag left. One of the things you can do with droids is make metaphors very physical. So where their evolution as people has gone is reflected very explicitly in their exteriors.
The book is, and maybe it seems kind of intuitive, but it's not always the case when you're reading Star Wars. It's very visual, even in action. It's very clear, it's very easy to follow. And a scene I was just thinking about was, in the space station when Ventress is killing, unfortunately, Jai and Max. That scene, the way that came together. What do you go to when you're trying to visualize something like that? How do you put that on the page? Because it really is. You can see that scene. There's no hand waviness in the writing. It really is. Every beat is so clearly written out.
It was a particular point of emphasis for me. One of the things on the short list of things I wanted to do in the book, I mentioned the Force is weak in this one. Another one is I wanted to do a tournament scene. Both the tournament scene and the Asajj scene, I don't know if anybody knows any of the other books I've written, but it is fair to say that action adventure is not what I was known for at that time. Lots of people moodily staring around having feelings about whatever, I don't know. Much more my thing. So I wanted to set myself the challenge that the fight sequences feel crisp and easy to follow, because I don't like the hand wavy thing. I know as a writer why you do it, but Kaylin will tell you that I will sit at home muttering and saying, special effects are not the plot. And I wanted the action sequences to be quite graphic. When I was in my 20s, I did enough martial arts, and I was actually, so this is behind the scenes. So when I was a teenager, I was a fencer. I was in fact I grew up in Canada. I was in a province called Alberta, which is basically 500 miles north of Montana. So I was a provincial champion fencer, which meant that as a 13-year-old, I beat a 12-year-old and two 11-year-olds to win a medal. But I had an experience that right before the tournament, Scout talks about getting too amped up and screwing things up when she shouldn't. I am literally the guy who lost a tournament bout to a guy I always beat in practice who had a broken leg. So I was intimately aware of this degree of screwing up. Anyway, long story short, I knew more about sword fighting than most people who have to write sword fighting do, I think. Not nearly as much as Neil Stevenson. He knows a lot about sword fighting. But between that and having done some martial arts, I wanted to try to think about how those things would actually go, and also try to, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's not especially interesting, but cinema violence, cinema action is lengthy and complicated and fun and full of cool stuff, and ideally also advances character with the fight scene. fighting in the real world is not much like that. Fighting in the real world is, if one person is significantly better than the other, the whole thing is over in 4 seconds. So trying to walk a line between the reality of what combat is like, particularly between people with whom there is any real gap, and what we, like, so I was at a fencing tournament, and a guy who was, when I was a highly ranked junior, and a guy who's in the adult section and had a decent chance of winning the whole thing, asked if we would spar together. I said, I'm not in your, and then, yeah, it's fine, let's do the thing. So we got it, 1, 2, 3, BAM! Like, I'm still sort of inhaling, and he's like, good one. Very good. Okay. BAM! Same exact spot. Exact, like the tip of a foil is the size of your finger. Hit me in the same place 5 times in a total accumulated about 11 seconds. And I was thinking, there is a moral in this somewhere, which is, you know, don't be a soldier. But anyway, so there's that kind of reality of fighting and the fact that no one wants to watch that. So is there a way that we can have those things that feel crisp and clean and believable and a little gritty and a little fun?
Well, to stay on that idea, that scene, the moment when Chimera acknowledges that Ventress just is better, that's a moment where it is one of those things where he's running out of time, but because it's Star Wars, you play with the idea that in that, maybe that last moment, he's going to embrace the dark side, but then he has this, you know, as Max is laying there, you can, if you embrace this now, that'll be forever be you, and it's just really interesting. Because everything you said is true for the real world. It is those 11 seconds, and you got it 5 times. But in Star Wars, you can work in the moral and you know, philosophical debate that's happening within a warrior. And one of my favorite lines, and it's one of my favorite scenes in the book, is when he smiles, knowing that he'll die on the light side of the Force. It's just a really, it's impactful. But before we open it up to questions, you did get a chance to write, you know, Padme and Anakin and Obi-Wan in this book. Was that, and once again, reverse engineering from the Revenge of the Sith script, was there anything in particular when you read that script and were like, I want to play with this with the little time I get to write those characters?
With those guys, with main characters from the script, I was pretty much coloring inside the lines as given. I mean, I try to give some interiority that makes sense, but I don't want to, that's a part of the ship that's not mine to steer, if you know what I mean. So I tried to get a sense for what they needed to do in terms of where the timeline was, then how we could fold that thematically to meet with this book. Hence the Arcanian, the Arcanian who leaves the Order is sort of part of that. And outside that, not give them reasons to think, what the hell are you doing with our franchise?
Yes.
I guess I'll pick up one thing, and if there are any of you who've already heard this story, I apologize. But just to sort of level set the whole thing about this book, I took it on and I thought, this will be a nice fun thing to do. And I don't have very much time, so I better just crack 2. And yet, I started out in a quite lighthearted spirit, and the longer I thought about it, the more pressure I began to feel. First of all, it was, more people are going to read this book than will read any other book you wrote, probably. Turned out not to be true, but mostly. More people have read this book than any but one of the books. And it's not particularly close. So a lot of people are going to read it, and in particular, a certain subsection of people are going to read it who don't go to church, don't go to temple, do not sit around meditating on the Bhagavad Gita, for whom Star Wars is very important. And there will come a day when their sister is in an accident, or their mom gets a diagnosis, or their spouse files for divorce, and they are going to want the book about Yoda to give them something for that moment. So no pressure, but in 4 months, write a rollicking space opera tale that nonetheless touches enough on the problem of evil to, I'm not saying this was an attempt to write great wisdom literature, but it had to have something, right? Like, you know that there are people who are going to come to this book looking for something and needing it to be there. And that felt like a great deal of pressure and a challenge that could not be honorably avoided.